Amen. Thank you so much, Tim. It's wonderful to be here, guys. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for choosing to spend your precious Sunday evenings here. I know that there's a lot that all of us have on, and I don't take it for granted that you've chosen to come here rather than the 101 other things you could have been doing. It's my job to try and make that as worth your while as I can. So that's going to be my agenda for the evening. It's lovely to see some old faces. Where's Annette? Where's Annette? Lovely to see, hi, Annette. Lovely to see some old friends. Lovely to meet some new people earlier before it started. Lovely to meet Tim for the first time, although we've been corresponding a little bit previously. Let me tell you what Tim told me to do, so that if I do this and then you don't like it, it's his fault, not mine. He said, could you please speak for about 45 minutes to an hour? And could you make it more of a lecture vibe than a sermon vibe? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. If you don't like it, you know where to go. I'm also going to assume something. You might want to sort of come back at me in the Q&A if this is not fair to assume, but just so you know where I'm coming from. I'm going to assume, because we're going to be talking about the Bible, that nobody here has an absolute bulletproof cast iron, there's nothing that anybody in the world could possibly say ever that would shake my faith in the Bible even one bit type of faith. I'm assuming that's nobody here. And I'm also assuming that nobody here is thinking there's absolutely zero chance in any possible universe that I would ever even give the Bible an iota of consideration. Frankly, if that's you, like, why are you here this evening? So I'm assuming that we're all somewhere on a spectrum. I'm certainly on that spectrum. I'm sure that if you worked hard enough on me over a given period, you could wobble my faith in the Bible. And I would assume that that's the case for most of us who would call ourselves Christians here this evening. And for those of us who are not, I'm guessing that you say, well, yeah, I can sort of conceive that potentially I could end up having confidence in the Bible somewhere down the line, even though I don't see what that might look like at the moment. And in other words, to use the language of the philosopher Charles Taylor, we're all cross-pressured today. Those of us who believe recognize that there are lots of people around us who don't believe in the Bible. And those of us who don't believe in the Bible, especially in a gathering like this, recognize that there are lots of people around us who do. And so we're all confronted with people not like us all the time. And that's sort of where I'm coming from in this. That's what I'm going to be assuming. Now, I think I do have, here we go. Ooh, back. There we go. Right, lovely. How can we have confidence in the Bible in this cultural moment? Huge question, isn't it? We could have a whole year of talks picking at this from different angles. So let me sort of narrow it down. I hope that these questions will hit a reasonable amount of the different ideas that might be in your minds. If I don't particularly scratch where you're itching, I'm sorry. I'm trying to sort of hit a lot of the things that I think people will be wrestling with in this area. And these are the 4 questions that I want us to think about tonight. Number 1, what does it mean to have confidence in the Bible? So when we talk about having confidence in the Bible, what do we actually mean by that? What does that look like in a person's life? Number 2, what has led us to the lack of confidence in the Bible in our current cultural moment? So I'm assuming that most people in Melbourne not only don't have confidence in the Bible, but think that's a very silly thing to have. And so how did we get there culturally? Number 3, 2 thoughts on having confidence in the Bible today. Among the many things that we could say, I just want to pick on 2. Why I think it's a reasonable thing to have confidence in the Bible. And then I'm hoping that we'll get to the section at the end there, what characterizes our current cultural moment. We may or may not get there depending on how long the other ones take. So that's where we're heading. So let's begin with our first question. What does it mean to have confidence in the Bible? And let me ask you a question. It'd be wonderful to be able to go around and hear everyone's answer, but big crowd, small time, not enough time to do that. But I really would like you to think about this in your own mind as I share it. Perhaps talk about it in the car on the way home afterwards. What do you put your confidence in to make sense of yourself and the world around you? What do you put your confidence in to make sense of yourself and the world around you? Because we all have to land somewhere, don't we? We all get out of bed in the morning and do something and not something else. We make choices. And those choices are all made on the basis of something. None of us are just flipping coins all the time. And even if we did, that itself would be a choice to flip coins, wouldn't it? So we're all committed. We're all in the game. We're all putting our confidence in something. We're all deciding for some reason or another. And I think it's really healthy for us all just to try and become more and more aware of what is actually driving me. Like, why do I put the confidence in what I put it in, and trust what I trust and distrust what I distrust? Because we're not often encouraged to do that in our society. There aren't many times when people say to us, slow down, just have a think, look at the past week. Why did you do what you did? Like in the big choices and in the little choices. What sort of wiring, what sort of software, if you like, makes sense of the way you're living at the moment? But it's a really helpful exercise. And so we're all putting our confidence in something or other. It might be the promise of, I don't know, reputation or riches or a happy family or peace and tranquility. There are many, many things that we will be putting our confidence in. And one of those is the Bible. And Christians would say, I put my confidence in the Bible. And what we mean, I think, one of the things that we mean when we say that is that we're putting our confidence in the overall story of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, to make sense of my life and to guide me in the sort of choices that I make. And so when I'm talking about putting our confidence in the Bible this evening, I'm not particularly in the first instance talking about individual passages of the Bible. You know, so was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? Was the earth created in 6 days? Those are conversations we can have, but that's not what I think is important when it comes to putting our confidence in the Bible. Because the important thing, as I experience it in my own life and as I understand the Bible itself to be talking, is the way in which the overall creation, fall, redemption, consummation story of the Bible, like the whole thing, is a story inside which we can live, that can make sense of us in its entirety. And so we're not talking about stories, you know, this chapter, that chapter, but the overall shape of the Bible's message. And it's a shape that really runs very, very deep in our society. You think of the majority of Hollywood films, certainly the superhero movies, they follow a particular pattern, don't they? And the reason they resonate with us largely is because the shape of the biblical story runs deep with us. So things begin nicely, don't they? Usually. Everything's fine. Something goes terribly, terribly wrong, and most of the movie is trying to put that thing right. It's often put right by an unlikely hero. You know, think Luke Skywalker, for example. You know, it's not the king, the great mighty one, who sorts things out. It's the little shepherd boy that, you know, from Tatooine, who fixes things. And then there's a huge climax, evil is dealt with, and everyone lives happily ever after. We dance to the rhythm of that story. We like that story. We pay money to go and see that story over and over again at the movies. And that is the story, is it not, of the Bible. So this rhythm of creation, fall, redemption, consummation runs deeply in us. And if we have confidence in the Bible, then we will be seeking for it to be the story that frames our life, that makes sense of who we are. And one way to think about how that happens is that it makes certain things in the world for us viable and visible and valuable. And let me just spend a moment unpacking what I mean by that. So viable. In in the sense that if we went out into the streets of Blackburn this evening with a microphone and did some vox pops and just asked random people in the street, have you ever considered trusting the promises of the God of the Bible? What do you think they'd say? I think most people would just look at us, wouldn't they? Like, what planet have you landed from? Like, that is not even a question that makes sense. Like, just this is weird. In other words, it's not viable for most people. It's not a category. Most people wouldn't say, well, yeah, I have actually considered that, and on balance, I decided it wasn't something I wanted to do. That's not where most people are. It's not viable. But then we, set out reading the Bible, and we see how God makes promises to Abraham and keeps them, even though Abraham's a bit of a rotter along the way. We see how how God makes promises to Isaac and Jacob and how they foul things up, but God keeps his promises. And we begin to build up a picture of what it would look like to trust this sort of God, even if we don't. I can see what the life of someone who does trust Yahweh might be like. And so it's become viable for us. We still might not trust God at all, but we can see that it's possible to do and what it would look like. So in other words, the Bible has made that thing viable for us in our lives. The Bible also makes things visible, doesn't it? You may have looked up at many sunsets in your days, but the thought may never have crossed your mind. Isn't that a wonderful testament to God's glory? Now you read the psalm, the heavens declare the glory of God, and you think, oh, yeah, I never thought of that. That's right. The sunset and the sunrise are a beautiful testimony of how glorious God is. Oh, I remember that now. The Bible's made it visible for you. And the Bible also makes things valuable for us. So if you'd have asked the pre-Christian me, aged about 14, have you ever thought that serving other people should be one of your life goals? I'd have said, no, quite frankly, and I don't really want to entertain that as one of my life goals. I'm quite happy with people serving me, thank you very much. It feels quite nice. And then I became a Christian, and you come up against verses like Mark 10:45, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then Philippians 2, where Paul says, have this same mind in you as Christ had. He made himself nothing. You think, oh my goodness, wow. This is clearly, if I'm on board with this Christian thing, serving other people has got to be right up there as one of my priorities. That's what Jesus did, and that's what we're commanded to do. And so the Bible has made that thing valuable for you that may not have been made valuable before. And to have confidence in the Bible is to lean into the way in which the Bible makes certain things viable and visible and valuable for us. And, of course, the Bible is not the only resource out there in society doing those very same things. If we take a lot of the sort of philosophers that I study in my line of work, and the modern critical theorists, as they're often called, this is what they're doing as well. So you may think that the idea of the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie and having a revolution in Australia is silly. And then you read a whole bunch of Marx, and you can see why, even if you don't think it's going to happen, why he thought it would. Why he was convinced that socialist revolution would happen. Okay, you can see, I can see how that would happen if you sort of buy into his assumptions and stuff. It's become something that's more viable for you. And a lot of these critical theories make things visible as well. And a huge example of this, isn't it, is the different waves of 20th century feminism. So look at the way that there are two different rules in society in so many areas. One rule for men and one rule for women. Notice that, please. Make that visible. And, the theorists like Simone de Beauvoir and others have time and time again said, look at these differences. Look how people are treated differently. And they're trying to make this thing visible for us in our lives. And these same critical theories also make certain things valuable. I learned very quickly as an undergraduate that whenever the word transgression was used in the philosophy that I was studying, that was going to be a good thing. Okay, we like transgression, we like sort of breaking rules and sort of crossing boundaries. And whenever tradition was used, whenever the word tradition was used, that was going to be a bad thing. We don't like tradition. We don't like the way things are. We like shaking things up. And again, they're making certain things valuable. Transgression good, tradition bad. And so we're faced with these different options, aren't we, in society? The Bible is making certain things viable and visible and valuable, and there are other ways of looking at the world that are doing the same thing with different things that are viable and visible and valuable for us. And we're all putting our confidence in some combination of these things. And I guess that's one of the points that I'm keen to make tonight. It's not as if some of us are putting our confidence in something and some of us are sitting on the fence. To the extent that we have all done things today and not done other things, made choices and therefore closed off other possible choices, we're all putting our confidence in something. That we don't have a choice. You don't have a choice. I don't have a choice. So the only question is, am I placing my confidence wisely? Not, should I put my confidence in something? Second question. What has led to the lack of confidence in the Bible in our current cultural moment? Now, I don't want to be naive about history. I'm not sort of assuming that there was some moment 300, 400, 500 years ago when everybody in Europe sort of believed in the Bible. Just historically, that's just not right. So I'm not sort of being nostalgic here, but it does seem that there has been a fundamental shift. Say, I don't know, since the 1960s, since the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps, that the public acceptance that there was for the Bible. So we're not talking about what people believed in their hearts now, but what people thought of when you quoted the Bible in public, that sort of thing, that shifted. And there was a time when, well, whether you believed it or not, you sort of had to, because that's what you did in public. Peppered your political speech with Bible verses or whatever. But really in Australia, certainly now, it's quite the opposite. You really wouldn't want to pepper your political speech with Bible verses at all. And if you did, don't check your phone the day after before you've had a strong coffee in the morning. Things have changed. And so that's what I'm talking about. What's led to that lack of confidence? And I want to make 2 points in relation to this. And the first is to do with what the sociologist Peter Berger calls plausibility structures. So his idea is that what we believe is, to a large extent, conditioned by the sort of society that we live in. Let me give you an example. So let's go back to, I don't know, 13th century France, something like that. Everything around you is sort of giving you little messages that reinforce belief in God. So that, the church is the tallest building in your village. And the church bells ring out as no other sound rings out in your village. And that's the one time when everybody comes together, whether they believe or not. They all go to church. The family structure resonates with the idea that there's a God who's in charge, the idea that there's a king over there in Paris sort of has resonances of there being a central authority. And sort of the whole of your life is whispering to you all the time, there's a God, there's a God, there's a God, there's a God, there's a God. And God is therefore involved in the whole of life. And, if you go up to the 13th century Parisian peasant with a microphone and said, do you believe in God? Well, I don't know how to answer that. Yes, everyone does. What's the alternative? And then as you sort of move into the 15th, 16th century, you start to get, and I'm sorry that the writing is a little small in these circles, you start to get a sort of a split. And you get emerging in Western cultures what people have called a secular sphere. A sphere that God isn't really involved with, isn't really that bothered about. And so there's still the sacred, you've still got a church, and that's still incredibly important, but there's also now a sphere of life that God isn't intimately involved with. You've got the sacred and secular. You can balance those, that's fine. And then as you move through into the 19th and 20th centuries, people like Peter Berger would say that sacred realm just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks to the point that for most people, it just disappears. And the whole of life is secular. And the word secular comes from the idea of here and now. There's nothing but the here and now to worry about in life. And the society in which we live is sort of whispering that to us all the time. So just think about your day. Think about all the choices you've made. You wake up in the morning, you choose what you wear, you choose what you drink, you choose the brand of coffee that you bought, you choose what you eat for breakfast. We fundamentally choose, we Christians, don't we, whether to come to church. Like, no one's going to tell me on a particular given Sunday whether I ought to be at church. I choose to come, but that's my choice. I choose where to eat lunch. I choose what channels to watch online. My life is just one huge shopping bag of choices. And then someone comes along and says, oh, by the way, there's a God who made everything and who has a law and who wants you to repent and follow him. And actually, the Bible uses the word be his servant. And you think, where did that come from? Like, there is nothing in my life that prepares me remotely for that. I am in charge. I make all my choices. If I don't like something, I just walk away from it. And there's no sort of preparation of the ground for anything like the biblical God to make sense. And so our plausibility structures are really quite aggressively militating against it making sense for us to have faith in God. And that's just worth us being aware of in our culture because, of course, those plausibility structures are not themselves the gospel, are they? They're not necessarily true. Lots of people in lots of different countries and lots of different cultures of the world over lots of centuries have had very different plausibility structures to ours. And so it would be a little bit arrogant, wouldn't it, for us simply to assume that ours are the right ones and everybody else is wrong. Everybody else in different cultures in all of history is wrong. We're the right ones. Now, it might be that we're onto something, but you've at least got to ask the question and not simply assume that our way of doing things is necessarily going to be right and everybody else is wrong. Just to be aware that our plausibility structures are pushing us away from belief in God today. The second thing that I want to point to in relation to this question of what's led to the lack of confidence in the Bible is the way that interpretations of the Bible have changed over the last few centuries. And I'm particularly thinking of a couple of books that I've read recently in preparation for this evening. One by a guy called Henning Graf Reventlow, The Authority of the Bible and the Rise of the Modern World, and one by Hans Frey, The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative. And I just want to try and quickly summarize what these two scholars are saying, because I think there's something in it. So, at the dawn of the modern world, so we're talking about 1600, there's a rise in the scientific way of finding truth, the scientific mechanism for disclosing truth. And people are quite keen to make the Bible fit in with that new mechanism. And they very often, this is really interesting, it's not non-Christians who are doing this, it's Christians who want to make the Bible appealing and believable to the culture around them. And so the first person here on the screen, John Locke, is a professing Christian believer, takes the Bible very seriously, peppers his philosophical writing with Bible verses. And towards the end of his life, he writes a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. It's had a massive influence on the history of biblical interpretation. And one thing that he says is it's a bit too much to ask people to believe the whole Bible. Let's just boil it down. What do you absolutely need to believe in order to be a Christian? And the answer that he came up with was Jesus is the Messiah. That's it. Full stop. End of story. Okay? So that's the whole ball game. Jesus is the Messiah. And he starts off by saying, well, you can sort of come to that conclusion just by looking at the way nature is. And he's got various arguments for why this is the case. So ultimately, you don't sort of need the Bible. It's really helpful, and it's great that we've got it, and let's quote it all the time. You don't sort of need the Bible to get to a knowledge of truth. And then you skip on about 100 years, and you've got Immanuel Kant here, who's essentially taking these Lockean ideas and pushing them even further. And so he wrote, again, this really influential text called Religion Within the Limits of reason alone. And his argument by this point is that, yeah, Christianity is really, really important. But what's important about it is not the actual story, this person did this thing on that day and that happened. That the really important thing about Christianity is its moral teaching, the ethics that it gives rise to. And we can sort of take or leave the Jesus bit. He's a great moral example of these universal ethical truths. But it's the truths that are the main thing. It's not what happened 2,000 years ago or didn't that's the main thing. So the ethics becomes the thing. It's about behaving in the right way, being a Christian. And if Jesus helps us do that, then fantastic. Knock yourselves out, believe in Jesus. But it's the moral principles that are the key. And so what we get over time, to simplify, is a drift that goes a little bit like this. So people like Locke will start off saying, we believe the Bible, and it's in line with what we know from nature, from natural law. Okay, so the two are walking in parallel. And then, a little bit later on, you get, well, we know that the Bible is true because natural law verifies it. So natural law is a thing that we can be really certain of, and natural law is in line with the Bible, therefore we can trust the Bible. So you see, the locus of confidence has sort of shifted. We still believe the Bible, but the reason we believe it has changed. It's now because we know natural law to be true, and natural law is in line with the Bible. And then in a third sort of moment of shifting, this is your sort of Kant moment. It's, well, the main thing that our belief is about is these moral truths, isn't it? Love your neighbor as yourself, that sort of thing. That's the real heart of it. And you can have that without all this inconvenient, sort of messy story about Jesus and all this stuff that happened and all the miracles and those sort of things. We can keep the essence of it, everything that's important, and get rid of these increasingly embarrassing sort of details. And then you come to the sort of late 19th century, and Friedrich Nietzsche comes along and basically says, no, you can't. You cannot have the ethics without the underlying reality. If there is no God, you can't do the Kantian thing anymore. And this is his whole death of God idea. And that if you take God out of the picture for Nietzsche, eventually you lose ethics as we've traditionally understood them. You lose humanity as we've traditionally understood it as well for Nietzsche. And then Foucault builds on Nietzsche later on. And so you can see how you get this trajectory leading to where we are now. So beginning with a sort of pre-modern idea that we can have confidence in the Bible, and the steps that take us to the current moment we're in, where, at least for a decent chunk of our society, we're not really sure what we've got confidence in at all anymore. Ethics is pretty much up for grabs. It seems that those who win debates, certainly online, are those who manage to shout louder for longer than everybody else and just shut the other people up. There doesn't seem to be an agreed standard of truth that we're all measuring ourselves against anymore. It seems to be increasingly a sort of a power game. If I can shut you up, then I've sort of won, and that's what it means to win. And so there's this story to tell about how we in the West gradually lost confidence in the Bible, how we got there, and what sort of state we're in at the moment. I'd like to make 2 points in relation to that. The first is that it seems to me that one place where this story misunderstands the Bible is it thinks that the Bible is just a set of ideas about the past, or facts about the past even. This happened, that happened, the other thing happened. And it's up to us to bring a set of tools to that to make sense of it. And that's where you get this natural law coming in. But I'm not sure that's quite true. Certainly as I read the Bible has its own set of tools for making sense of the world. It tells you what happened, but it tells you how to make sense of what happened as well. So if you've got a Bible with you, just flick with me over to 1 Corinthians 15. And it's a beginning of that passage where Paul is making a claim about what is most important in the Christian faith. Let me just read a couple of verses and then make a quick point off the back of it. 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 1. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you've believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared, etc. I just want to focus on verse 3. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. I think what we've got here is three separate elements that build up what philosophers call an epistemology. In other words, a way of how we know things, an account of how you know stuff about the world. So first of all, Christ died. It's a historical claim. Somebody stopped living in history. So that's, if you like, that's the factual claim. This thing happened. Christ died. But for our sins is not a claim about a fact, is it? It's a claim about what that fact means. This person stopped breathing, and that has significance for our relationship with God, for our sins. It's an interpretation. So already we've got the Bible brings its own interpretation of facts. And here the Bible brings its own interpretation. Well, now we might disagree with it. We might say, no, he didn't die for our sins at all. But nevertheless, the Bible is making a claim about what it means, not just about what happened. And thirdly, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. The Bible is making a claim about how we can know this, what sort of tools we can bring to bear and making sense of this. And the claim here is that hundreds of years before this happened, Isaiah, for example, in chapter 53, wrote about this. This was predicted. People said this would happen. And that's the, if you like, the intellectual tool that you should bring to make sense of this. Now, again, we might disagree. But the Bible is making a claim about what happened, why it happened, and how to know it. And I think that's what the early moderns were missing. They were thinking the Bible makes a claim about what happened. And we've got to bring to it tools of our own to say what it means and how we know it. And I think that seems to me to be somewhat hubristic on our part. Stand aside, Bible, I'm the one who brings the tools, to know whether this is true or not. Because it seems to me that if the God of the Bible is who he says he is, I know it's a big if, but if he's who he says he is, and if I am who the Bible says I am, and again, people will disagree, but just grant me those two for a moment. If God is who he says he is, and if I am who the Bible says I am, then God is better equipped to reflect reality properly and honestly and truthfully than I am. And therefore it would seem to me that if the Bible is correct, then I should go with the Bible's way of understanding truth, rather than assuming that the tools that I bring to it will necessarily be more effective, which I think was what the early modern world was doing. And the second point there I've made already, everyone begins with faith. We're all committed to something. There's no one in the room who is not putting their trust in something in life. Again, we might want to talk about that in Q&A afterwards. But I think it's hard to argue that one is utterly uncommitted, that you're not putting your faith in something or other. And the only choice is whether we're aware of what we're putting our faith in and whether we've thought about it, or whether we're just sort of, if you like, drifting with the current and putting our faith in what everybody around us puts their faith in, and we haven't really thought about it at all. So 2 thoughts now on having confidence in the Bible today. And before I share these 2 thoughts, I just want to give 2 sort of preliminary remarks. The first is that when it comes to having confidence in the Bible, according to the Bible itself, is not just an intellectual exercise. It implicates the whole of us, because if the Bible is true, it makes claims upon us. God makes claims upon us. And so we're not some sort of dispassionate observers looking at this from the outside, trying to weigh up whether we think this thing that doesn't affect us is true. Like, if it is true, it changes everything, and therefore we can't be dispassionate about it if we're going to take it seriously. It changes our view of ourselves and what we should seek in life. And therefore, it's helpful personally when we're thinking through these things, not simply to see it as some sort of intellectual exercise out there, but to recognize that there are reasons we may have both for believing and for not believing that are not simply to do with truth claims, that are to do with us and the way we want to live our lives and so forth. Now, that's not just true, this point is often made, isn't it, of non-Christians. It's true of Christians as well. If you're a Christian here, don't think that this doesn't apply to you. We drift along with the people around us. Church is quite nice. There are lovely people like Annette here to make friends with. And so, you know, we believe because it's nice and comfortable, and we haven't really perhaps wrestled with the fact that if you take that away, what's left? Martin Lloyd-Jones, the English preacher, Welsh preacher, sorry. Ooh, Welsh preacher. Sorry, any Welsh people here? Had this wonderful image where he said, we can either be overshadowed by the truth or shot through by the truth. And being overshadowed is like, well, you know, we're Christians because people around us are Christians, and there's some nice people at church and we're friends. But that's not being shot through by the truth. Shot through by the truth is take all that away, and it's still, there's still a confidence in me that's not simply the air that I'm breathing. And I just want to make that point because Christians often make that point about non-Christians. They say, the reason you don't believe is that you want to live your life this way or that way. That might be true. But don't think as Christians that doesn't apply to us, that we have the same pressures. We need to ask ourselves the same questions as well. So, first reason that I want to suggest that might help Christians to have confidence in the Bible today is that understanding how the Bible relates to the culture in which we live. And I think my impression, at least, you may disagree, I don't know, is that this is something that Christians tend to struggle with quite a lot today. And we tend to sort of drift to two extremes, two poles. And one of them is to sort of see everything in the culture as a threat. And I need to denounce it and say, you know, this is not the gospel, this is wrong. I need to put clear blue water between the Bible and whatever the latest cultural trend is, because if I don't do that, I'm not being a faithful Christian. And so you sort of adopt a negative posture to the culture. The culture is a threat. We need to denounce it. We need to expose it and so forth. And that's one extreme. And it's a caricature. But it's a tendency that we can drift towards. The other tendency, and you'll have to think in your own hearts which of these you're more drawn to, is that Christians are terribly anxious to sort of get alongside the culture and to affirm all the bits of it that we can affirm, and to say, you know, I understand you, I feel your pain, I'm walking in your shoes, to use the catchphrase of the moment, I get you, and to try and show that Christianity is relevant to where people are. And the tragedy, if you like, of that split is that neither of those things are utterly wrong. Like we don't want to be saying as Christians, we never say that anything in culture is wrong. We never denounce anything. Everything's wonderful. Yeah. Nor do we want to say that nothing in the culture is worth preserving, and that there's no value in listening, hearing people walking in their shoes, trying to understand how life is for people who don't believe in God. The tragedy is that those are split apart. If you like, dismembered limbs of a healthy body. And that some Christians feel that the only valid biblical posture is one of denunciation, and other Christians feel that the only valid biblical posture towards culture is one of affirming it and saying, you know, I hear you, I see you, I feel you, and so forth. And so what I want to do for a couple of minutes is share a biblical passage that I think charts a healthier route through the relationship between the Bible and contemporary culture than either of these tendencies. I found it incredibly helpful in my own thinking and in having confidence in the Bible myself, and that's the reason that I'm sharing it with you today. It's 1 Corinthians 1, if you want to follow along in the Bibles, and it's where Paul, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, here we go, 1 Corinthians. It's where Paul is talking about the dominant values in the culture around him. Let me just read it, actually, as it stands in the Bible, and then I'll make a few points off the back of it. So I'm reading from 1 Corinthians 1, and let's start at verse 20. Where is the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where are the philosophers of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom didn't know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Many years ago now, in a hotel room in Luton, near Luton Airport, I heard a sermon on this passage by Tim Keller that has been such a help to me over the decades now. And it's the essence of that sermon that I want to share with you. So these are not my own ideas, but they're ideas I find incredibly helpful. It went something like this, the sermon. He said that Paul begins by identifying the core cultural values in the two people groups that are around him. So you've got the population of Jews, and what they want is a demonstration of God's power in a miraculous sign. So the idea of signs at the beginning of the passage is replaced by power later on, if you want to just check that for yourselves, that I'm not making it up afterwards. And so they're after power. And then there's another population of Greeks, and they're not particularly bothered that much about power. They want a demonstration of wisdom. Like for them, the peak of cultural achievement is the orator, in the toga, holding forth in a philosophical sort of school. That's what they see as really having arrived. If that's you, then you're at the top of the tree. So he identifies these different tendencies in the culture around him. And I've tried to represent these in a diagram because I like diagrams and I think quite diagrammatically. So the idea here is that the line ascending from the bottom left up to the top right is that these are aspirational values for these people groups. Signs are really, really good for the Jews. Wisdom is really, really good for the Greeks. But then what Paul does is he sort of rains on that parade, if you like. And he says, not sorry to disappoint you, I'm delighted to disappoint you, that's not what I'm coming with. I've not got wisdom, I've not got power in the way that you are looking for them. I've got Christ crucified. And there's this idea of Paul preaching the cross. That's the second arrow here. And he's under no illusions how they're going to receive this message. He says it's a stumbling block to Jews. The word there is scandalon. It's a scandal for you. Like, by the way, the Messiah was crucified as a criminal and he bled to death and it was really horrible. That's not only wrong for the Jews, but people who hang on a tree are cursed. Like, that is, how dare you? You just insulted the whole idea of a Messiah, saying that he was crucified. That is the 180 degrees opposite to what the Messiah is. How dare you? It's a scandal. And for the Greeks, of course, you say, well, you've got this idea of a person in a toga, sort of giving wonderful philosophical truths, and I'm going to talk about a man who can't even breathe because his lungs are collapsing. on a cross and he's a criminal and he didn't save himself and he's bleeding to death. And similarly, the Greek goes, well, there's a lot of things that are wise, but that ain't one of them. Like, someone dying on a cross is the opposite of wisdom. Like, that is not anybody's idea for the Greek of what wisdom is. And this is this idea of this third arrow here. If you notice, it sort of bounces off the bottom of the cross. It's not going through the cross. For the Jew, it's a stumbling block. For the Greek, it's folly. There's no wisdom here. There's no power here. What are you talking about? Why are you bothering us? And at this point, you've got an antithesis, haven't you, between the gospel and the culture. Like, Paul is not saying, oh, Greeks, you're almost there. Like, just add a little Christ cherry on the top of your wisdom cake and we're all good. Like, just stick a label on the wisdom you look. That's not what he's doing, is it? He's on a collision course. He's cruising for bruising at this point, isn't he? He's taking them on. He's saying, I'm coming to you with something that you find offensive, and the Greek word for folly is the word from which we get moronic. It is a moronic scandal that I'm coming to you with. And if that's all that Paul said, then those groups of Christians in our society that say the way that we engage with culture is all about being oppositional and denouncing it and saying that it's wrong, they would be cheering Paul from the stands, wouldn't they? He's our guy, listen to him. Foolishness, it's a scandal. We've been telling you all along. And he doesn't stop there, wonderfully, in a way that wrong foots us, I think. He goes on, doesn't he? Because he says to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks. So for everyone who's got eyes to see this, and there'll be some of both people groups, but not everybody can see this, he says. He's not sort of fooling himself that, suddenly once he said this, everybody's going, oh, I see, you're right, how could I have been so silly all along? He's not saying that. For those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. He goes on to say, doesn't he, that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. And this is what I'm trying to convey with this fourth arrow here. So Jews demand miraculous signs, Greeks seek wisdom on the bottom left. If they pass through the cross, they will find God's power and God's wisdom. And so at this point, Paul is saying something like this. Are you really, let's take the Greeks, are you really serious, dear Greeks, about searching for this thing you call wisdom? Are you serious enough to search for it in the last place you'd ever think of finding it? In the bloodied cross of a man who can't speak. Because if you are willing to search for it there, you will find a wisdom the riches and the depth of which your philosophy hasn't even imagined. You will find connection with the ultimate ground of being in the God of the universe. But there's a catch, if you like. I mean, it's a catch that's out in the open. It's not a trick. You've got to let God rebuild your idea of what wisdom looks like. If you continue thinking wisdom is someone standing up, a little bit like I'm doing this evening, I guess, and everybody sort of thinking that they're wise, and I'm not, that's probably not me. You're thinking, what is he talking about? But if that's your idea of wisdom, you're never going to find it. You're always going to find the cross foolish. But if you let God break down and rebuild your idea of what wisdom can be, and I know that makes you vulnerable. I know that's not comfortable. And I know that it looks silly because this looks like your opposite of wisdom. But if you let God do that, then it will blow your categories of what wisdom can be and what it means to be wise in this world. And at that point, the people who want to get alongside the culture are cheering Paul on from the stands, aren't they? Saying, yes, you're searching for wisdom. Good. Wisdom is something that is right to want. Power is something, dear Greeks, that is right to want. Find it in Christ. And the brilliance of Paul's approach is that he is flat out on antithesis. He never waters down the idea that God's wisdom is foolish and that God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. He never backs away from that. But he's able at the same time to be white hot on the idea that the gospel fulfills the cultural desires that are around among the Greeks and the Jews. And so if you see, he's doing what the people who think the Christian duty is to denounce the culture are doing. This is foolishness in your eyes. It's not just continue on a little bit further on the way that you're going and you'll find what you're looking for. He's not saying that. But he's also doing what the people who think that we need to get alongside culture and hear people and listen and feel their pain and so forth are doing. Wisdom is the right thing to search for. Just you can't find it in the way you're looking for it. Let me help you see where it is. And I found this posture from 1 Corinthians 1 just to be such a great help in navigating my own way through the Christian life. Not sort of knee-jerkishly thinking, oh, whatever the latest fashion in culture is, I've got to denounce it in order to be a faithful Christian. Might end up there, but that's not the only tool in the toolbox. Nor thinking, well, whatever people are saying, I've just got to get alongside and say, oh, yes, I agree. Just add Jesus to that and you'll be good. I think it's a much subtler, more rich approach to culture. And I think part of having confidence in the Bible is seeing how it does both sort of take on in an antithetical sort of way the values of our age. And, you know, we might replace power and wisdom today, I don't know, with freedom. That's one of the big ones, isn't it? In our culture, perhaps equality in some areas. We have our own values that we put in the place of power and wisdom. And it does confront those. But it also fulfills those. It shows how the gospel, the cross of Christ, is the only rigorous, deep, exhaustive fulfillment of those values as well. And I found that to be an incredible encouragement in thinking my way through cultural issues and in maintaining a confidence in the Bible, in the sort of culture in which we live today. So that was my first thought. The second one is an idea that I got, and again, I just found really, really useful over the years, from the theologian John Milbank. And he wrote this really influential, difficult book called Theology and Social Theory. It's quite old now, but he's dealing with a lot of these issues of how do we make sense of culture from a Christian point of view. And he has this idea in the book of out-narrating. And he says something to the effect of, everybody in society, all the different positions are trying to out-narrate each other today. And what that means is there isn't a shared sense of what makes something true anymore. So everybody is trying to explain everybody else's story within their own story. Let me give you an example. So the Freudian, the psychoanalyst, would say, you Christians, I know why you believe in God. You actually don't. You think there really is a God. It's very, very foolish, actually. Let me explain to you why you really believe in God. You see, you're wired to desire a father figure and this thing called the superego. You can read about that in all of my books. And you've projected this idea into the sky. And it fulfills your need for some sort of lawgiver, and therefore you've created this God. That's an example of out-narrating. I can make sense of you, Christians, better than you can make sense of yourselves, because you don't really know yourselves, but I do. And the Darwinians are doing that. Some of them that take Darwin as a philosophy rather than a sort of idea of natural science are doing that. And the Nietzscheans are doing that. And everyone's doing that to each other. And Milbank's point is that, wait a minute, the Bible is also doing that. The Bible claims, again, may or may not be correct, but the claim is there, nonetheless, to make sense of life more adequately than these other positions, and to make sense of those other positions, Freudianism and so forth, to be able to explain them to themselves better than they can explain themselves. So the Bible is out-narrating these different philosophies in our society. And there is no better example of this than Augustine's City of God. Very big book, very long book, very complex book. If you've got the stomach, I really, really would recommend you read the City of God. If you want to sort of take the challenge up, Charles Matthews, the Augustine scholar, has a series of audio and video lectures. You can get them, I think, off Amazon. They're available elsewhere as well. Introduction to the City of God. That's what made sense of it for me, because I'm not a classical scholar. So if you want to get into the City of God, Charles Matthews lectures, gold dust, City of God in one hand, Charles Matthews in your ears, makes sense of it. But what Augustine is doing is he's telling the story of the whole of the Bible in the second half of the City of God as a lens through which to view late Roman Hellenistic culture. And he seeks to make sense of Rome better than Rome can make sense of itself. And often this is quite comedic in the way that he does it. So there's this one moment where he's saying, so you Romans have 3 gods to take care of a doorway. You've got a god for the hinges, you've got a god for the threshold, and you've got a god for the door itself. And he sort of looks at that and he says, well, usually sort of one door person is enough, so I'm not quite sure why you need 3 gods when one person could do the job. And so he's looking at Roman culture sort of from the side as someone who's not breathing that air, but who appreciates it, who understands it. And he's able to tell Rome's story, I think, in a way that's persuasively richer than the story that Rome can tell about itself. And that's the pattern, therefore, of out-narrating. Let me just hit these points on the screen really, really quickly, and then we'll wrap up. He is both an insider and an outsider to the culture. And I think that is so incredibly helpful for us, those of us who are Christians, in making sense of the culture in which we live. To be an insider in the sense that we're able to understand and explain the way that people in the culture think in a way that they would say, yes, you understand me. Those are the words that I would use. That is the way that I would put my own position. We're an insider to that extent. But also an outsider in the sense that, to use that phrase that's often used of John Bunyan, our blood runs bibline. The way that we experience the world is through the lens of the Bible, not through the lenses of modernity. And it's that combination of being an insider-outsider that I think allows a really rich and subtle critical appreciation of late modernity. And it's what Augustine has in relation to his culture. He uses the whole of the Bible story, which I think is just really healthy, because when our cultural critique zeroes in on one particular passage or on one particular biblical idea, it tends to be a bit lopsided. It tends to either be it's all creation and everything's wonderful and we're all one happy family, or it tends to be sin, 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 sin. Everybody's, going to hell in a handcart apart from Christians. Let's just sort of bolt the door shut and let the world burn outside of us. But using the whole of the story, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, means that every bit of the Bible gets to have its say, and you maintain that healthy balance of the biblical story. He also looks at the whole of late Roman culture, which I think is just, again, incredibly helpful, because it's a temptation for all of us, I think, to focus on particular things within the culture. So that's the problem right there, look at that. Get rid of that and it's all fine. And it depends sort of where we are politically as to what we focus on. So if we're Christians broadly on the left, we might say, look at that corporate greed and rampant capitalism and the exploitation of workers. Isn't that awful? That's the thing we need to focus on. And perhaps if we're Christians sort of broadly on the right today, we might say something like, well, look at that woke culture. Look at the way that that's ravaging society. Just get rid of that and it'll be okay. Because both of those are making the same error in thinking that society is almost like a Lego set and you can take one brick out and everything else remains the same, rather than understanding that this is an ecosystem and these ideas haven't suddenly sprung up out of nowhere. They've all got histories and they're related to other ideas and assumptions. And so we don't see ourselves as some sort of SWAT team descending into society, neutralizing the threat and then airlifting ourselves out again. We're in here for the long haul, and these ideas are all connected to each other in different subtle ways. And then finally, sorry, I can't resist just a little word of Latin. I've only got 1 minute left, so you're not going to get much of this. But gloriosissimam. This is the first word of the City of God, and it is so cheeky. So Augustine has, as the first thing that he says, so there's no chance to set the context yet. He goes right in there with, and the Latin is gloriosissimam civitatem Dei. So translated something like, the most glorious city of God is the theme of my book, he says. And the reason that this is so cheeky is that glory is the Romans' word for talking about themselves. Like you ask, Joe or Josephine, average Roman, what are you proud about? And they say, Rome is glorious. And what they'd mean is, we beat everyone in battle and kill them and take all their gold and make them slaves. Like, that's Roman glory. It's not particularly a Christian idea. It's not the sort of thing you find Jesus doing. And he takes that word and he makes it the first word of the city of God. So before he's had any chance to set any context, he says, this is glory right here, the city of God. Very provocative as a move. And later on, he gets to define glory. And the way that he defines it is he says, Lazarus, the flea-ridden beggar at the rich person's gate, that's glory. And then the Roman is thinking, what are you on? It's like Paul again in 1 Corinthians 1, like there's a lot of things that are wise and the cross is not one of them. Like how on earth is Lazarus glorious? But of course, as we read to the end of that story, we see that Lazarus is welcomed, to use the language of Luke 16, into Abraham's bosom with a richness and a heavenly glory that the rich man in his palace can only dream of. With all his retinue and with all his gold and with all his servants, he never got anything like that. So Augustine is doing exactly the same thing. There's a collision course between the gospel's values and the culture's values. This is glory, by the way. Lazarus, the least glorious thing in your universe, is actually glory. Deal with it, Romans. And then, no, actually, even by your measure, this is ultimately the most glorious thing. This is the fulfillment of what you're searching for in your palaces and your servants and all that sort of stuff. So it's antithesis and fulfillment. Not fighting against each other, not 50-50, not some sort of woolly compromise, but full-bore antithesis and white-hot fulfillment of cultural values together. I think it's what makes 1 Corinthians 1 so very, very special, and it's what makes the city of God so special as well. Now, I've overstayed my welcome by 1 minute at this point, so I better wrap up. But I think the idea is that we have a little bit of to and fro, and people can please. I don't know what the vibe is here. Please feel free to disagree. You may be thinking, no, I feel really, really free to disagree. Don't worry about that. But if you want to sort of just give an opinion. If you want to ask a question, ask a question. You want to just agree with something, that's fine. Just basically, I'm here to help.
Well, first of all, let's just show our appreciation to Chris for his talk tonight. Thank you so much. Yes, and so we'll have time for a couple of questions. That's probably all. So if you've got a burning question, pop your hand up and I'll come to you with the microphone. Anybody? Otherwise, yes. All right.
What do you think are some of the current cultural narratives that the biblical narrative, has the potential to out-narrate?
Thank you so much. So what was your name, sir?
Scott.
Scott, thank you, Scott. I think that one of the big ones is what the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, who I think Tim mentioned a week or two ago, calls the modern emancipation narrative. And his argument is this. He says, ever since sort of Hegel, 19th century, we've had this idea that the one heroic story left to us, because we don't really believe in ancient sort of war-type heroism anymore after Vietnam and the First World War. That's not how we become heroes anymore. That's really problematic. The one narrative that we've got left of how to be a hero is to throw off the chains of oppression, to emancipate oneself in whatever way we understand that. And he says that modern Western society now runs on the fuel of this emancipation narrative. That's how we understand ourselves. We are the people who are becoming freer and freer, and therefore always finding oppressions to liberate ourselves from. That's our self-identity now. And I think that the Bible does something to that, akin to sort of 1 Corinthians 1 thing, which first of all is to point out that where did we get that idea from to begin with? Like the idea that I should see myself in terms of becoming ever more emancipated, because that's not culturally universal. Like the ancient Egyptians didn't do that, the ancient Babylonians didn't do that. Like where did that begin? And I think there's a good argument to say that it began with the Exodus story. So in the Exodus, you find a people whose self-understanding is based on an act of liberation. That's quite strange. Like we were slaves is not something that you want to sort of broadcast, but the Hebrew people do. You know, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's how God identifies himself. I am the liberating God. And Michael Walzer, the Jewish writer in his book called Exodus and Revolution, says that that is the archetype for the way that the West does its emancipation these days. And we can agree with that or not, but that argument has been made. And so the first thing I think the Bible would do is say, yes, absolutely, freedom is what the game that God is into, to speak slightly irreverently. That is what God does. God is the liberator. But I think that the second thing that it would do is say that is a moment, a significant moment within a bigger story. And if you lose the bigger story, it becomes harder and harder to make sense of the gesture of emancipation itself. So in the Bible, it's creation, fall, and the emancipation moment, being freed from slavery in Egypt, is part of the redemption, part of how God restores us to himself for the purpose of living with him. So 1 Peter 3:18, to bring you to God. And that makes sense of emancipation. But the critique would be that in the modern West, emancipation has become self-justifying. I become freer because becoming freer is the thing that I need to be because I need to be freer. And that has done a lot of good work, but it also has its pathologies and its blind spots. And so in order to, if you like, have the fullness of emancipation, it needs to be part of a bigger story. Now, it's a huge part. Like, the New Testament language about the cross refers to the Exodus more than it refers to anything else in the Old Testament. Like, this is not a footnote in the Bible story. So emancipation is massive, but it is part of the biblical flow of the story. And to wrench it out of that and to say that to make it sort of justify itself is problematic and doesn't give you the fullness of the richness of what emancipation can be. And then, there'd also be critiques that the modern West only understands oppression in quite limited terms and doesn't have any sort of notion of transcendence or relationship with God and so forth. So it would be massively affirming the value and importance of emancipation and actually saying this is right at the heart of the Bible. But you can't have the fullness of it unless you see it within the richness of that biblical context, because it becomes a wheel spinning in the air that's self-justifying.
Awesome. All right, another question? Anybody? Yes.
Thank you, Chris. Annette, how does this play out for you in daily life? How do you make sense of it in culture, in conversations, in a secular environment, and when you engage in those conversations?
I think, Annette, it's a great question. I think one of the things is that it gives you, when one is at one's best, because I don't want to sort of come over as, I've got this all sorted. Let me tell you about how, I've got a wonderful life, because I don't. When we're taking this story seriously, I think it gives us a posture in, the secular workplace and just in the modern world that's sort of characterized by a humble confidence. And I think it's quite easy to have either one of those, but it's really hard to have both. So it's quite easy to be humble if you just let people sort of walk all over you and, you always agree with them, whatever they say. That you can sort of do that quite easily and sort of sail through life without too many problems. Or, depending on your personality type, you can just be the attack dog that takes everyone on all the time, and then people learn to back off, because they're going to have a fight when they talk to you. And there's a sort of sense in which that's relatively easy, certainly for some people to do as well. But I think the Bible puts you in a position of recognizing that it's not on your shoulders, on my shoulders. Like, the Christianity isn't about me and whether I can express it correctly. It's about him, thank goodness, because, and so there's a sense of a blessed, freeing, emancipating self-forgetfulness about it. Like, it doesn't stop with me, and if I stuff up, then, that's not what it stands or falls on. But there's a massive confidence, because I know, to use Paul's language, I know him in whom I have believed, and I know he's trustworthy, and I know he's worthy, and I know that he can take that weight that my shoulders can't take. And so providing I point people to him, I know that I'm doing the right thing. And I think it's that combination of being genuinely humble, and there's a false humility, isn't there? We're all quite good at that. I hope it's not just me. But those moments when you find that genuine humility, and also a genuine rich confidence that I think provides us with a way of relating to the world around us that, we could do a whole list of things. It's not scared, it's not angry all the time. It's got time for people, but it's not a doormat. And it's just, there's a complexity to that way that the gospel positions you. And just one, I know that we've got to stop, but just one more thing on this that I think is so, so helpful. It's that, and this again is straight from Tim Keller's The Reason for God. We all draw lines between in-groups and out-groups. Like, by default, you've got to. So, either it's the good left-leaning liberals who want equality, and it's the nasty conservatives, or it's the other way around, or it's the good people who don't draw lines and the bad people who do draw lines. We all draw lines. And all those lines that we draw predispose us to looking down our nose at other people on the other side of the line. So if it's a line of rationality, well, we're the rational ones, and to use the rather sort of old language of the new atheists now, we're the brights and so forth, and you look down on your nose at superstitious people. Or, you look down on people at the other side of the political aisle. But Keller's point, and this is so liberating, again coming back to Scott's question, is that our line is a line of grace. So we are Christians, not because we were cleverer or smarter or more moral or humbler or whatever than anybody else. There's nothing in us that puts us on this side of the line. It is, Ephesians 2, it's grace from first to last. And therefore we have no legitimation at all for looking down on people on the other side of the line, people who are not Christians. So my Hindu, my atheist, my Muslim neighbours may well be more moral, more upright, more loving, more considerate, more rational, cleverer than I am. Because that's not why I'm a Christian. And that, again, just frees us up. Like, if I have a conversation with someone and I get mangled and completely pulverized, that's okay. It happens. Like, I don't need to win to vindicate my identity. Do you see what I mean? Because my identity is not in me winning. It's not in me being clever or moral or giving more to charity than the atheist neighbor who gave 10 times as much as me, and that's really embarrassing. That's not the ball game. It's grace, and I think that just gives you a freedom. One way of putting it would be a freedom to fail. That my identity is not on the line in the way that I relate, and I can stuff things up, and God is still God. It's a very long answer to a very rich question.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to ask the final question, since I've got the microphone. How would you go about sharing your faith or telling this story to a contemporary Australian, like a colleague or a friend, and they say, Chris, why do you believe what you believe?
Okay.
How would you go about answering that question?
Well, the last time a generic friend came up to me and ask me that generic question. No, I'm joking. But it's so different, isn't it? Like, we're all so different from each other that it's really hard to answer in the abstract, without knowing what my history is with this person. Like, are they work colleagues? Are they family? And it just... So anything that you can say in answer to that question is going to be very sort of vague, and there's going to be a lot of people saying, well, that wouldn't work with me. And, well, that's because we're all different. I guess the reflex in answering that sort of question, if we're Christians, ought to be, well, what pointers does the Bible give me? How would the Bible set me off trying to think about that? And I think one of the great passages to go to is 1 Corinthians 1 there. So Paul is engaging via the Corinthian Christians with the big narratives of his age, and he's starting off where people are and say, you Greeks, you've got this thing called wisdom, and you think it's really great, and you look up to the people who've got wisdom, and you look down on the people who haven't got wisdom, and this sort of organizes your world for you. Let's start picking at that a little bit. Have you found the wisdom you're looking for? Well, it sort of seems that you're always bouncing around from one philosophical school to the next one, and so it seems that you still haven't found what you're looking for, and so there's this desire in you that's unfulfilled. And, as he does in 1 Corinthians 1, say, well, I'm afraid I'm going to say something that's probably going to make you walk away at this moment. I think, wisdom is to be found in a man being executed, dying on a cross. And let me try and explain myself. And then you go into the idea that God has made foolish the wisdom of the world and so forth. And, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, most people are going to go, that's just silly. Like, there's no expectation that you sort of pull the lever and everybody go, oh my goodness, the gospel. I suddenly realize, where have I been all my life? It's like, and again in Acts 17, isn't it? Most people say, this is ridiculous. And they got Paul preaching to them. And most of the crowds, when Jesus preached to them, also were like, just show, do one of your tricks, please. They didn't get it. And so I think our expectation shouldn't be that there's this one way of putting it that's going to, sort of cut right through and everybody's going to, suddenly see the light. But I think the expectation should be set by the Bible, that in 1 Corinthians 1 terms, to those whom God has called in ways that we never get to see, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so I suppose one thing is don't be afraid to do the foolish bit. Because it's not by appearing wise in the eyes of our interlocutors that we're going to win them. If the biblical pattern is correct, and I guess as Christians we want to start from the idea that it is, it's the cross. To sort of repurpose that phrase by Bill Clinton, it's the cross, stupid. That's what it's all about. That's where it stands and falls. And a lot of people are going to scoff at that, and they're going to think it's moronic and a scandal. And that's what we ought to expect, because that's what happened to Paul, and that's what happened to Jesus, and that's what's happened to Christians. So I think right expectations and not being ashamed of that core message of the cross, which, of all the bits of Christianity, why does it got to be this one? Like a bit of Sermon on the Mount might be nice. But the cross is so central to Paul's preaching, to the way that Jesus understood, what he came to do. So to lean into that, but not to expect it to be some sort of silver bullet that everybody's suddenly going to say, oh, that's so wise. I'm so glad you shared that with me.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And again, friend, let's show our appreciation. It's been such a treat to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time.
It's been lovely.
And I guess as we finish up tonight and head out, are there a couple of resources that you might suggest, apart from, say, Augustine's City of God, which I did try to read at one time and I'm not sure I finished? Are there a couple of other resources that you might point people to if they're interested in digging into this further? Your book, of course, being one of them.
Yeah, so it is hard to say this without sounding cliched, so I'm just going to sound cliched. The Bible, because I don't want that to come over as super Christian.
Well done.
But
that passed the test. Yeah,
essentially, what all these other books are doing is they're pointing to the Bible, aren't they? And they're helping us understand the Scriptures. And so if we're not engaging with that firsthand, and if we are Christians, we believe that the Word of God is living and active, and that, as Hebrews says, as the Holy Spirit says, present tense in the Word, don't harden your hearts. Like, if we're not engaging primarily with the Bible, then we're sort of dabbling in the paddling pool and not getting into the ocean. In terms of sort of paddling pool resources, Charles Matthews on the City of God, I think, is a stepping stone to get into it, definitely. I think stuff that John Stott writes, I mean, he died at the end of the last millennium, and his writing is a little aged now. But the way that John Stott handles the Bible and culture side by side, and the posture that he has in relations, is just really, really helpful. He's got a book, Issues Facing Christians Today, which is sort of now issues facing Christians a generation ago. But you can sort of get the vibe of that, how he deals with stuff. I think the writing of Tim Keller is really, really helpful and has been a huge blessing to me. His preaching, actually, the sermons that are now available for free on the Redeemer website, just listening to how he talks as well as what he says, listening to how he engages with culture, it is just really helpful. Whether or not we choose to sort of do it, and I'm not saying copy him, of course, be oneself, but the patterns and rhythms that he has of engaging with culture, I think, are just incredibly helpful. And that's free. It's the Gospel in Life website. They're all free. Just Google whatever you want to, topic you want to find out about, and download it for free.
Yeah, brilliant. Wonderful. Well, we're going to draw our evening to a conclusion.